Hi, this is Tiago.
And this is Stephanie. We are from hexdevs.com, and you're listening to the Hexdevs podcast.
We talk to developers building interesting stuff. Our goal is to share actionable insights to take you to the next level so you can build a business, grow a team, improve engineering culture, and build useful software.
If you have been listening to the show and you like it, do us a favor and subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite platform. You can also leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts. Enjoy this episode.
Today's episode is with Michael Lynch. Michael is a software developer and blogger. He used to work as a software engineer at Google, but he decided to quit and now he runs small software businesses of his own and blogs about the process. Michael has recently launched the course Hit the Front Page of Hacker News. The course teaches you everything he has learned about Hacker News after getting many of his original blog posts to hit the front page of Hacker News. It covers the site's unique culture and how to choose topics, improving your writing, and what to do if your submission fails for some reason. In the last 12 months, over 80% of his blog posts have hit the front page of Hacker News, and 4 of them shot all the way to the number 1 slot. His $15,000 a month business owes its success to an effective launch on Hacker News. So make sure to check out Hit the Front Page of Hacker News if you want to get better at blogging and get more traffic from it.
Congrats on the launch, Michael. I've learned a lot from your course, not just about Hacker News, but writing in general. And thanks so much for being here today.
Oh, sure. Thank you for having me. And I really appreciated the feedback you gave me about the course.
Sure. Was this the first time selling a course?
Yeah, this was my first course.
And how long did it take you to create it?
Way longer than I expected. So I got the idea from listening to Daniel Vassallo on the Indie Hackers podcast, and he was like, "Oh, I decided to record my first course, and it only took me 16 hours." And so I did all the slides and recording and published it in 16 hours, and I made $150,000 in the first few months. And I was like, "Oh, that sounds good. I want to make $150,000 in a few months." And I knew I wasn't going to make that much because Daniel Vassallo has a huge audience. But I thought, like, I'd been thinking about doing an info product, and hearing him say that he got through it end to end in 16 hours is like, okay, like maybe I could do it in 40. And then it actually ended up being way longer than I expected. So I think I probably spent about 200 hours on it total.
But do you regret it?
I would do a lot of things differently if I were to do it over again, but I think it was definitely good to get the experience and try doing a course for the first time.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess that's why some people recommend, for example, to start with a tiny info product, for example,
Right.
an ebook, because it's something, it makes it easier for you to finish it.
Yeah, I had thought like I ultimately do want to write a book, and the course seemed to me like the easier one. Like I felt like, oh, a book, I'll like edit that forever. That'll take me a long time to write. But a course, like Daniel could do it in 16 hours, then that sounds pretty fast. Because with my writing, I tend to like want to rewrite things a lot. Like even my blog posts, I'll spend maybe 15 to 30 hours on a 2,000 word blog post. So I felt like a book would take me a lot longer. Yeah, looking back, I don't know. Maybe an ebook would have been an easier first try.
But I don't think you would ever know if you didn't try it first,
Right,
right?
right.
So, do you have any metrics about it? Like, did you make some money?
Honestly, it's a little lower than I expected in terms of revenue so far. So I think I'm at like 2,200 in sales on Gumroad, and then $600 from the Blogging for Devs community because I gave the 3 private sessions in that community, which you both were part of. And so yeah, I'm at like a little under 3,000, and my goal was 2,000, but 20,000 by the end of the year. So I'm not sure if I'm actually going to make that, but we'll see. Like I know Rob Fitzpatrick wrote the book The Mom Test, which didn't get a huge reception at first, and then it spread through word of mouth. And so it could be like that, or it could be that like the launch was the biggest it's going to be, and it's going to be just like a long tail from here. But yeah, we'll see. It'll be interesting to see how it turns out.
Yeah, for sure. You mentioned the blogging for devs community. Yes, we are both part of it, and I always like to recommend it to everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty valuable.
It was cool because you kind of test your course with blogging for devs, right? So you did a couple of calls and then you shared with people and then people gave you feedback. Did that change the content a lot? Like did the feedback made you change things a lot, or was it just kind of expected feedback?
No, the feedback, I mean, some of it was expected, but there definitely was a lot of feedback that made me change the course. So probably one of the biggest changes I made was telling more stories about my own blog. And when I started writing the course, I felt like it would come across as too self-indulgent if I was just like, oh, and then when I wrote this post, this happened. And oh, while I was writing this post, this other thing happened. Like it felt just like way too into my own writing and my own story. But like I had a few of those in the first session and people consistently gave me the feedback that they wanted to hear more of that. And like the thing that's missing from a lot of guidance online is like actual stories of what happened when you wrote this type of blog. And like people liked hearing about blog posts that succeeded, but they also really liked hearing about blog posts that failed and what I learned from the ones that kind of flopped and went nowhere. When I went back and redid those sessions, because I would always do like a practice session for blogging for devs and then record the real version, I would update the slides and add in more stories that were like personal stories from my experience of maintaining the blog and submitting to Hacker News. And that continued to be what people responded to. And it's funny because one of the pieces of advice I give in the course that I had from the beginning is how important it is to frame your blog posts in the form of personal stories. And I completely missed the fact that that's what I should be doing in the course as well.
That's interesting. I think honestly, after you do certain things on your own, it gets harder to see that you're the only one doing it. So
Right.
maybe that was it. So Michael, actually, we wanted to talk more about the backstage process of going solo founder
Sure.
and also about your financial independence journey. You mentioned on Blogging for Devs that Mr. Money Mustache played a huge influence on getting you started with FIRE. FIRE, for those of you who don't know yet, is financial independence, retirement early. And I guess my first question for you is, what does financial independence mean to you?
For me, it's being able to have enough money that I don't have to worry about money, that I'm not working to survive. I'm working because the things I'm doing are the things that I'm interested in. And that's always really appealed to me about people that have achieved financial independence, that you get to take on projects that the reason you take on the projects are independent of how much money they'll earn for you.
How long have you been working towards your financial independence?
It's tough to say. I've gotten more serious about it over time. I think I started thinking really seriously about it when I was about 25. So that was 10 years ago. Because my first job out of college was at Microsoft. And 4 years into it, I I had always wanted to take some time to travel. And I knew that the longer I waited, the less likely I'd have the freedom to do that. And so I didn't take any particular time off. I had about 2 years of savings. In the bank account. And so I quit my job and sold all my stuff and moved to South America and just kind of backpacked around. I purposely didn't have a return ticket or like any kind of plan for, I didn't want to have a time limit because I knew if I had a time limit, I just feel like, oh, I only have like 3 months left. Oh, I only have 2 months left. And so I wanted to make it as open-ended as possible. And while I was doing that, I realized that that was so much fun. Like I loved being able to just wake up every day and do whatever I wanted. And so I was like writing my own software. This was before I was aware of like indie hackers, or I mean, indie hackers didn't exist at the time, but I didn't know anybody was doing anything like that. I was just like writing my own software and like had no plans for like how to actually sell it or market it. And I was learning Spanish and just like meeting people and having a ton of fun doing that. And then finally I decided to move home and start working again. But when I did that, I was so deflated to just like have to go back to a job and like have to, I remember like the first day, or it was actually like the second day when I started a job again, I was like 15 minutes late, and my manager came up to me and was like, well, we do start at 8:30. And I was like, oh, I just spent a year like waking up whenever I want and not having to answer to anybody. And so that experience made me really recognize how appealing it is to be able to have financial independence. And it's also like when you're backpacking, you're meeting a lot of people who have found a way to do that. It's like a lot of digital nomads or people that have retired early or figured out some way of like working a few months per year and traveling the rest. And so the number of people I knew in the US who were doing that was very low. And so just like being able to travel and meet so many people that are doing this in many different ways, it opened my eyes to how possible that is as a lifestyle.
That must have been brutal going back to work after you mentioned 2 years.
It wasn't. It was a year
Mm.
of probably an employment gap.
And then you have to wake up early and
Right.
traffic, commute, all of that.
Yeah, it wasn't fun. But yeah, that gave me a lot of motivation toward like, okay, and now I know what I want, and so I have to figure out a way to get there.
And so did you kind of planned for your financial independence, like say, oh, I need this amount of money in order to retire or be financially independent? And did you calculate your fire number and all of that?
No, I thought about it more in terms of building a business. Like there's a few authors it's funny, like I actually don't like them overall, but they did influence the way I think about financial independence. So one of them is James Altucher, and he wrote this book called Choose Yourself, which like I feel weird mentioning because I overall don't like the book, but he had this point that the middle class is increasingly losing wealth, and the people who are able to achieve financial independence are the people that have their own businesses. And so that really like hit home for me, the importance of creating my own business. And then the other author, like same kind of feeling as like Rich Dad Poor Dad by Robert Kiyosaki. I read that I think when I was in college, and he talks about the importance of building up assets, just things that will continue to bring money for you either passively or actively. And so when I was thinking about financial independence in my mid 20s, it was less about like getting to a specific number and more about like, okay, how am I going to come up with assets? How am I going to accrue investments or like come up with a side business that can start making me more than what a salary would pay me?
And how did you find out about Mr. Money Mustache?
I had just kind of seen one of his posts in passing and didn't really understand what he was. The first post I ever read was like he starts driving for Uber, and I was like, what is this guy doing? And then it wasn't until like 4 or 5 months after I left Google, one of my readers emailed me this article about the 4% rule, and I'd never heard that before. But the idea is that if you can accrue enough savings or get your living costs low enough that you can survive on 4% of your savings. So like if you have $1 million and you can survive on $40,000 a year, then you're pretty much set for life, because it's not that hard to accrue to earn a 4% return on your investments, even through like down markets and a lot of volatility. Like long term, it's 4% is pretty achievable. And so the idea was like, I had thought about retirement in terms of like, okay, I need like millions and millions of dollars. But once it was put to me in the terms of the 4% rule, I was like, oh, like $1 million and $40,000 a year, like that doesn't seem that hard. I mean, I expected that like having a family, if it was just me, I probably could last on $40,000 a year. But if I want to have a family, and then I live in the US, so if I have some kind of medical disaster, that would be very expensive and potentially bankrupt me if I only had $40,000 a year. But it put into perspective how much more achievable it is and how much low cost of living can really influence how much earlier you can retire.
The biggest misconception that I see is that people underestimate how much their expenses play in their future, and
Right.
they think that it's a matter of making more money. Of
Right.
course, they help. It's not about how much you make, it's about how much you save. So, do you plan to achieve your financial independence and go back to South America or go to Asia? What's in your plans?
No, I'm sort of worn out from travel. Like I think I had more stamina for it when I was younger in my 20s. Now I enjoy just having a home base and kind of being comfortable. So like I right now I live within about like a 15-minute drive from my parents and my sister, and so it's really nice having family so close by. I mean, it doesn't do me a lot of good in the past year because of the pandemic, but in normal times it's nice to be so close.
I guess you mentioned on your blog that you spend about 20,000 a year. Is that right?
$20,000 a year. I think that was from businesses. So uh, like personal expenses. I'm not sure what my personal expenses. It's probably maybe like $20,000 to $30,000 total each year.
It's pretty good. Like if you're doing a business and you make some extra money, you can totally cover that, right? It's just a matter of finding something that works and having a couple of different income sources, and it's not that hard if you think about it.
Right, right.
Was working at Google a strategic movement to achieve financial independence faster for you, or was that unplanned?
No, it wasn't planned. It's funny because I actually thought I would make less working at Google than the other companies I was considering. And I mainly chose Google because for pretty much all of my jobs, I haven't thought about salary first. I've thought about like what I'm going to gain from the job and whether I'll like the work as the first concern, and then thought about salary after that. But I ended up getting a really good salary from Google, and I'm not sure if they just this is the salary they were giving to everybody or I got a especially good deal, but when I was applying, I also applied to this cryptocurrency startup, and it seemed like the cryptocurrency startup didn't know what they were doing very well. And so I don't think they had a good sense of what a reasonable offer for me would have been. And so I was pretty sure I wasn't going to take it. And so I just threw out a really highball number. For me, at the time I applied, I was making $120,000 a year or so as a consultant for this consulting firm. And so I was like, like what if I just told them 150,000? Like what would they say? And so I said that to them, and they were like, "Okay, yeah, that sounds doable." And then they're like, "Wait, is that including equity or excluding equity?" And I was like, and like I thought about it as like total compensation. And then when they said that, it seemed like they expected me to they had interpreted it as like before equity. So I was like, "Oh, 150,000 before equity." And they were like, "Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah, that's reasonable." And I was like, "Okay, great." And then the offer they gave me was like $150,000 plus $100,000 in equity. And I was like, "Wow, that's like the craziest offer I've ever received. That's much higher than anything I'd made before." And then I didn't want to work for them, but it allowed me to just take that offer letter and show it to Google and say, "Hey, there's other companies offering me 150,000 plus 100K in equity. Can you beat that?" And they're like, yeah." And so they did 140,000 plus $10,000 signing plus $200,000 in equity. And I was like, "Whoa, this is crazy." Like I went from $120,000 to basically like 190 to $200,000 a year. And like I'm terrible at negotiation, like that wasn't planned at all, but it ended up being a huge step up that I didn't expect at all.
I guess you just learned right away.
Yeah, it worked. I was lucky that it worked out that way.
You mentioned that you are living in an area close to your family, and
Mhm.
in your blog post you say that you bought a house and that decreased your expenses significantly. What do you think you would have done differently in terms of your financial choices besides moving to a low cost living area?
No, I don't think like if I had known about financial independence or like discovered something like Mr. Money Mustache earlier, I don't think I would have done much differently. Like it's hard to say because I feel like the choices I made worked out so well. Like I really like where I ended up. And so there's nothing like I don't look back and think like, oh, if I had only like saved more money at that point. Like I almost feel like I should have done the opposite. Like I think in my 20s, I cared about saving money. This is maybe terrible advice for financial independence discussion, but I feel like the amount I was saving in my 20s is so small to the amount I was making later on. So I almost wish I just like cared zero about saving money when I was in my 20s. I mean, I basically did. Like that was the nice thing about having a job at Microsoft is the pay was high enough that it was easy to save. But yeah, I don't think I would have changed that much. I like, especially financially, where everything ended up.
And that's interesting. And it's funny because when you mention, oh, I had a high salary anyway, and for a developer, that's kind of the default in a way. So
Mhm.
developers usually get a bunch of money.
Yeah.
And if you try to keep your savings rate high enough, you're just gonna live a good life and save a bunch of money, which is something
Hmm.
that is not sometimes is not evident or not easy to see, but the savings rate is probably the most important part, especially because when you look at return on investments and things like that, if you're planning to be financially independent soon, you're not going to have that much time to grow your
Hmm.
investments just by the return. It's mostly
Right.
more related to the savings, right? And then
Hmm.
by saving more, you also need less to live.
Right. But I think the other thing to keep in mind is like, if you expect your income to grow rapidly, then like say if I'm making like $50,000 a year just out of college and I'm trying to save 10% of my income, that's like gonna be a bit harder on my lifestyle than 10 years later when maybe I'm making $200,000 a year and it's very easy for me to save like $50,000, and it might make the money that I was saving 10 years before seem irrelevant. But it depends. Like, it depends on how your income is going to change. It depends on the kind of investments you make. And obviously, compounded interest is really powerful, and it can grow even small investments over a long period of time. But um, yeah, I think it's also worth discussing, like, or worth thinking about at least, how you expect your income to change and whether the impact on your lifestyle of making savings when you're early in your career and you don't have a lot of room for savings um, is worth it relative to like how much you'll be able to save in a few years if your income goes up significantly.
From our experience, for example, until last year, we were too fixated on the savings rate. And, although we live a pretty good life and we were saving approximately 70% of our
Mm-hmm.
income, but I realized that it was getting harder for us to invest in some stuff. For example, education.
Yeah, I think it's about optimizing like for satisfaction with life, not necessarily like optimizing for um, any particular financial number or savings rate. Like the savings rate can be a good guide to meeting your life satisfaction goals, but it's not the goal in itself.
I think everything that you go too extreme about it, like you don't save anything, but also you try to save too much, that's
Right.
probably not healthy.
Right.
So you were working at Google, you had a pretty good salary, and
Hmm.
you're probably saving a lot of money, you have a good
Right.
life, but then you've tasted freedom before, and then you
Right.
have all of this money, and I guess it becomes hard to work for people, right? Can you tell me about that? Like, how was your experience, your experience having a lot of money, but not, but also remembering that freedom? Was it hard for you?
Yeah, it was hard for me. I think it was hard for me when I didn't enjoy my job. Like when I was working on a team and felt good about the work that I was doing, then I didn't really feel like it didn't feel like I was trapped. Like I liked when I was learning new things and getting to take on exciting projects. But when like toward the end of my time at Google, there were a bunch of reorgs and I kept on my projects kept getting reset, and it definitely did feel like, what am I doing here? Like, is it just for the money? Like, I'm here just to like keep earning money, or is it even worth staying? Because especially like the last maybe 9 months or so, I knew I was going to leave. There's the way compensation works at Google. It's sort of clumpy. So the best time to leave is when I did on February 1st. It's like when your annual stocks vest and you get your bonus and everything. And so I was debating, like, should I just leave before then? Like, is it really worth like 5 more months of my life to get whatever, like this percentage of my yearly comp? So that was definitely hard. And like, especially like, I think it was maybe 4 months before I knew I was going to quit. My team just like got dissolved, and I had to go find a new team. And it felt like such a silly process because I'm meeting all these new teammates, and I'm like, I know I'm going to leave. So it felt dishonest in a way. Like I didn't want to tell people, oh, by the way, I'm going to leave, because then it's just like weird to hang around for, like a defined amount of time that everybody knows you're going to leave in X months. But at the same time, it felt like very demotivating to just be in a job where it's purely for the money, and especially like those last, like maybe it was like 6 weeks or so. The way it worked out was because of like vacations and holidays and stuff. I had to work, I think like 6 weeks total to get maybe like 40% of my annual comp. And those 4 weeks, it was I was on a like completely new team, new project. I knew I wasn't going to finish it because I knew like I was going to leave in that time. But it was just very much like showing up to work every day and counting down the hours and like looking forward to the day that I got to announce that I was leaving.
How did you, I don't know, how did you keep motivated? Like, did you already have a vision of what you wanted to do?
Not clearly. Like I think in some ways the way I envisioned working for myself was really off, and then in other ways it was really accurate. Like I think it was very very much incorrect in that I think I had sort of like a Silicon Valley startup sort of expectation of what running my own business would be, where like I just launch I just like come up with an idea for like an app, and then I find a bunch of users, and I don't really care about how they're going to pay me. I'm just like going to make something that's popular and then later figure out how to monetize it, like Facebook and Twitter and all these things. I was like, oh, that's what I'm going to do. In that sense, I had it really wrong, but in other ways, um, like I thought it would be fun to just think about like all the different decisions you get to make as a business owner. Like, oh, I've got $5,000 in revenue, so should I spend that on marketing? Should I spend that on more development? Like there's just so many different possibilities. Like, should I try to do like a publicity stunt? Should I write a blog post about what I'm doing to try to get more people interested? What kind of customer should I go after? Like, it was really exciting to me to think about just like the amount of freedom I had, especially being a developer at Google. You have so little influence over the direction of the product you're working on. Like I was working on, and you're also so far removed from the customer. So like I worked on backend stuff on the Google Maps team. So I was probably like 4 layers of abstraction away from anything that an end user even saw. It was like I worked on a piece that some other system called that, and then like eventually that bubbled up into like a UI that the user could see on Google Maps. But it's so distant from the user, and like I have so little influence over the direction of the product, because that's determined by like directors and managers and VPs and stuff, and like all coming together. Whereas I had looked forward to like, okay, if it's my own business, I get to make all those decisions. I can decide like what direction I want to go in and how much I want to spend on like things that I think are important, like code quality, and I'll get to see if they really pay off the way that I think they do. And now that I'm experiencing that it's like exactly as fun as I thought it would be. Like I really love being able to make these decisions about how to allocate these resources that I have, like how to allocate the resources of time and money and people working with me.
And one of the things that can be hard when you're starting a business is figuring out what to do, because you're pretty sure you don't want to work as a software engineer, being separated from the users and all of that. You
Mm-hmm.
want to take control of your project and your product. But
Right.
then how did you learn to prioritize, and how do you get an idea of what to do? Because it's hard. It's not that obvious.
Yeah, that's the thing that's still very difficult for me. I think the best thing that I learned was to not go too deeply into any one idea. I think the thing that helped me the most was just learning that the importance of being able to evaluate the potential of business. So if I'm like 2 or 3 months in and I'm not earning money the way that I expected, or like I don't find customers that are interested in actually paying money for this, then it's a pretty good sign that I need to either move on to a different idea or like drastically pivot the idea into some other customer niche, or some other angle. And that was a thing that was really missing in the first probably year or two when I was working for myself, where like I would like the first thing I did was start this cryptocurrency blog about like a niche cryptocurrency that I knew about than most other people. I knew more about this cryptocurrency than most other people. And I just like had no plan for how that was actually going to make money. And like it was just so far removed from anything that would actually make money. And I spent like a month doing these public tests on the cryptocurrency that nobody had done before, but like there was no point to it. It's just people thought it was interesting, but there was no way I was making money from that. And it took me a while to really learn like, okay, you need like an actual plan. Like it doesn't need to be like a formal business plan, but you need to find somebody that's like, yeah, I want to pay you money. Like here's a pre-order, or like I'm going to order from you if you can solve like X problem for me. And a lot of my earlier ideas didn't do that. And the growth was just being able to, I guess, bail early if I decided that if I could see that the idea wasn't going anywhere and revenue wasn't growing in the way that I needed it to grow in order for it to be a sustainable business.
And do you do any research before getting started? Like say, oh, we had this idea to do something. And do you do any research before starting working on that, or you just kind of follow your gut?
No, I definitely do research. And I mean, that was the problem at first, was just going by like untested hypotheses and starting to like write code and spending weeks and weeks writing code without and thinking that I would find out after it was done, when often I didn't really need to do that. And one of my friends, David Toth, who maintains who sells an app called Inkpad, he told me that before he starts any project, he comes up with as many ideas as he can, and from that he just keeps coming up with good ideas that he thinks are viable, and then picks the one that he thinks has the best chance. Like he researches a short list and then goes with whatever is the best from his list, because the point he made is that it's so expensive to explore an idea, and people don't really recognize that at the time, because to pursue an idea can take you weeks or months or even years to see if it's going to work out. And so the the most influence you have over how much time you're going to spend on that process is before you even decide which idea to pursue seriously. And I've really taken that to heart. And I'm not as good as he is at coming up with lots of viable ideas. I think I'm just not as creative as he is in terms of good business ideas. But I try to come up with like a few ideas before I pursue anything, and think seriously about, okay, like what's the market for this? Like are there similar competitors in this space? What are people paying for products like this now? Like what evidence do I have that people would want to pay for this thing that I'm making?
Do you remember any other things that you have learned after you left your job?
Yeah, one of the big lessons I've learned probably in the past year is just how powerful writing is, and how it's such a huge advantage to be able to write effectively. So I've been blogging for 5 years, and I didn't really strategize much about my blog in the first few years. And I always felt like, oh, my blog is just something I do for fun. And if I strategize too much about it, I'll make it not fun. And over time, I started realizing like, oh, well, it's most fun for me if people read the things that I write. It's really disappointing when I spend a month writing a blog post and then I can't find anybody who actually is interested in reading it. And so I got a lot more strategic about what topics I choose. And I also realized that it's such an effective tool in terms of bringing attention to a business. So my current business, Tiny Pilot, it's this little device that lets you control servers remotely. So um, it's it's a Tiny Pilot, or it's a Raspberry Pi rather, that you can plug into a server, and then you can control it as if you're sitting in front of it. So it pops up a little um, web interface that you can type and move the mouse and stuff and see what's on the screen. And so the thing that made that really launch was the blog post I wrote about it. So before I wrote a blog post about it, I'd only managed to sell 2 units. Like there were 2 customers that were interested in paying for it. And after I wrote the blog post, it reached #1 on Hacker News, and it was popular on a bunch of different subreddits. And there are people that have sold similar products, but they aren't able to write about it in the way that I do. I think like I had learned all these lessons over the years about blogging and about the importance of making things a story. So like the way I wrote this blog post about Tiny Pilot was just the story of me developing it and like little by little getting things to work that were a struggle at the beginning, and then like slowly overcoming those obstacles. And so I think people really responded to that story and like really liked the way that I wrote it. And so that ended up driving a ton of traffic. And so for the first, I mean, to this day, it's still probably the biggest driver of sales to the business is the blog post that I wrote about it. And that's, it got written up on other blogs. People were just linking to this write up I did. And I think that's a thing that a lot of startups miss, is that like a lot of people start their businesses and then they really struggle to get people to pay attention to what they're making, but they don't know how to get customers interested. They don't know how to find users that would be interested. And I think they don't realize how effective it can be to learn to write really well, and like how it's something you can do for free and get people really interested in what you're working on and get people interested in the products that you're selling.
I've been super fascinated by this idea of distribution and building a media business first. So if
Mm-hmm.
you look at Nathan Latka, he has a pretty much a media business. He has a
Mm-hmm.
podcast and he has a magazine and all of that. And he got pretty good at distribution. So he creates content that people are interested in, and then from that he creates little businesses related to that. So
Yeah.
to me, when I see your blog and then when I see how you post on Hacker News, is a way to distribute your blog posts, and then it's also a way to distribute your products, right? So getting attention
Right.
to you and then to your product is a good way to make your business scale, right? Especially developers don't really think about that. They just, oh, I'm going to write the best code, I'm going to build the best product, but they forgot about marketing and distribution, which is
Right.
super
Definitely.
important.
Yeah.
After quitting your job at Google and learning how to prioritize, how do you keep yourself motivated? Because there's a lot of ambiguity. There's a lot of doing things that don't work, or sometimes they work, but it's not exactly how you planned. So, how do you keep yourself motivated? And is there any pressure to keep building stuff and figure things out? Like, do you have a pressure to make a lot of money right now?
Yeah, that's a good question. I haven't ever really found a difficulty in staying motivated. There are a few times where I'm working on a business for a while and it's like not growing the way I expect. But for the most part, I've felt pretty motivated. Like I find it fun that I can just work on whatever I want, and I have the freedom to stop working on something if I don't feel like it's going well. I don't have real pressure. I just have pressure that I put on myself. I I struggle with figuring out the right amount of pressure to put on myself. I think I actually put too much pressure on myself. And that was definitely a problem I had right when I left Google. I was like, okay, I'm going to take on all these different projects, and then I felt really stressed that I wasn't making progress on any of them. And then I took a step back and I was like, nobody cares. Like I made these deadlines up. Nobody's waiting on me. Like why am I getting so bent out of shape that I'm not meeting these deadlines? And that's also something I struggle with now with Tiny Pilot. Like it's the business is going really well, and one of the biggest things that is one of the biggest challenges is just keeping up with inventory. And it's like one of those things that they call a good problem to have. Like I'm selling so fast that I can't keep up with inventory, but I feel this pressure to make sure I never have to like list my products as sold out or on back order, because I'm like, oh, if I do that, I'm basically leaving money on the table, and I don't want to do that. But really, like, who cares? Like, I'm enjoying what I'm doing, and I shouldn't worry so much about like, oh, okay, I have to list something as back ordered for a week or so until I catch up with inventory. So I think it's just like being able to step back. And something I found that's really useful for me is writing monthly retrospectives. So I just summarize what I did for the month, and I talk about my biggest challenges and what my plans are to address them, and just being forced to like take a step back and think critically about what I'm doing has been really helpful for me in recognizing things like, oh, why am I getting so worried about, if I'm out of stock of something for a week? Like who really cares about that? It's not a big deal if my revenues are a few $1,000s less than the maximum they could have been that month if I was better about inventory.
So, Michael, what advice would you give to someone that is thinking of leaving their jobs and maybe taking some time off, or even just going straight to start a bootstrapping business?
I think a big piece of advice would be to expect a lot of failure. I think the success stories that you hear about people launching a side project and it makes $500,000 right out of the gate, those are like obviously the exceptions, because there's a bias toward outstanding stories, and it's a lot more common for people to try a side project or try a side business and it fails. And so I think it's really easy to get discouraged if you come in with the expectation that what you're going to do is succeed. I mean, for me, like the first 2 years or 2.5 years I was working for myself, I like was making negative income. Like at the end of both of my first years, I had a few $1,000s in revenue, but my costs were much higher than that. And so it wasn't until like the 2.5 year mark that I finally landed on a project that started making money. And by doing that, I realized it's just such a thin line between success and failure with startups or lifestyle businesses, because it's just like you could come up with an idea that seems perfectly good and it turns out to fail for whatever reason, or you could just happen to get lucky and you come up with a good idea. So I found that people seem to get discouraged a lot faster and like burn out faster if they have this expectation that they're going to succeed early. And I think that the people who tend to do better are the people that keep their expectations low and have a lot of patience and prepare for a long haul. And the way I've always thought about it is like, I expect that every business I start is probably going to fail, but I think that every time I do start a business, it increases my chances of success on the next business. And, like just by the law of averages, like one of the businesses is going to succeed if you have infinite tries. And so if you can plan and get a lifestyle where you can give yourself a lot of opportunities to keep trying, then it's going to make it a lot easier for you to succeed eventually. And just you have to maintain that attitude that it's going to take a while.
That was a question that I actually wanted to ask for myself.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, but I hope to help more people, because it takes a little bit of courage to take that leap.
Yeah, so your job is not to quit. You have to keep trying.
Right.
Awesome. Okay, so Michael, thank you very much for sharing your experience with us. I do hope Hack and Use course get lots of traction. I think people will find it out because it's a really good course. Yeah, thanks so much for talking to us today.
Oh, thank you. It was a pleasure.
If you enjoyed this episode, please support us by leaving a rating on Apple Podcasts. Also, subscribe.
Thanks for listening, and see you in the next episode.